Single action truss rods, double action truss rods. Which is the best choice for your guitar building project? I'm Chris at Highline Guitars. I'm going to try to answer that in this video. So as I've just mentioned, there are a variety of different kinds of truss rods that you can select from when installing a truss rod into your guitar project. And you might be wondering, which is the best for what I'm going to be trying to achieve? Is it the single action rod or the double action rod? Now the reason why I'm bringing this up is because whenever I'm looking for topics for new videos, I always look at the comment section of videos that I have posted in the past, looking for inspiration for new videos. And in the last week, I had gotten a bunch of comments and questions from viewers about truss rods. And that kind of tells me that YouTube must be pushing one of my videos that I made in the past where I was talking about truss rods. And that inspired a lot of comments and questions. But what was interesting is they were asking less questions and really more about commenting about the general concept of how truss rods work. So I thought it would be a good idea to make a video that would explain it in a little bit more detail so that you can make the right decision when it comes to selecting the type and style of truss rod for your guitar build. Now the truss rod, essentially what it's supposed to do is to control the amount of up bow that occurs in a guitar neck when it's placed under string tension. And as you know, when you tune the strings, you're putting a lot of force, pulling force, on the headstock. And what that does is, in most cases, it pulls the headstock up. And that creates what is described as an up bow, kind of this curve, like a ski slope. And that in turn can cause the strings to sit way too high off of the frets. It is essentially excessively high string action. So to control that, the truss rod was added as a way to force the neck back into a flatter, straighter position. Not necessarily completely flat, but it was intended to control how much up bow was occurring. Now the first truss rods that came out were single action truss rods. The first truss rod was actually invented by Gibson back in 1921. And it was just a rod. It was not adjustable. And it was intended to try to resist or to reinforce the neck so that it would resist the string tension. But then as time passed, they began to figure out ways to make that rod adjustable so that you could control how much the neck was bowing. And that continued for many years, and most guitar companies, you know, Gibson and Fender, Rickenbacker, all of them were started using truss rods to control how much the neck would bow under string tension. And they were all single action truss rods. But then in the 1980s, an innovation occurred where we now had what is known as the double action truss rod. A single action truss rod can only control the bow in one direction. It is designed to flatten the neck out when the headstock is being pulled up. In some cases, a guitar neck is going to encounter what is known as back bow, where it actually, the string tension, because of the geometry of the neck and the headstock, will actually pull the headstock down, creating a hump rather than this bow shape. When that happens, a single action truss rod can't control back bow. It can only control up bow. So in the 80s, this innovation to create the double action truss rod came to be. And then all of a sudden we had the ability to adjust both the up bow as well as back bow with just the double action truss rod. So that became really popular, and now we find the double action truss rod is equipped on more guitars than the single action truss rods. But the single action truss rods are still out there and are still being used in guitars. And I think the main reason for that is because in most cases the neck is going to experience up bow rather than back bow. Back bow is not as common. And I have found in my own experience that back bow generally occurs when you have the neck installed at an angle with a steeply angled headstock. And that's typically found on Gibson Les Pauls, SGs, any guitar that uses, for example, a tunematic bridge where you have to angle the neck in order to get correct string action, you can encounter what is known as that back bow. You can also encounter a different kind of unusual situation. It's an S bow, and that's where the neck starts to form a hump, but then it goes into more of an up bow, so it's kind of an S shape. No truss rod can fix that perfectly. All a truss rod can do in that situation is to minimize it, but it can't eliminate it completely. But that's not as common either. It's still, the most common is the up bow. And for that reason, the modern two-way truss rod is what most people use. So when it comes to selecting a truss rod for your guitar project, what should you consider? How should you decide between a single action and a double action? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to personal preference to a certain extent, but it's often personal preference that's driven by tradition and versatility. In the case of tradition, if you're trying to build a guitar that is a replica or a clone of a vintage guitar, like a 50s Les Paul or 50s Stratocaster or even a 60s or 70s Les Paul Stratocaster SG, you probably would want to stick with the single action truss rod if your goal is to be authentic in that recreation, because those guitars in most cases use single action truss rods. You can tell on a Fender guitar, for example, like this one, because it has that skunk stripe. And what the skunk stripe is, that's actually a slot that's routed to install the truss rod, the single action truss rod. And then this skunk stripe is a strip of wood that has a curved surface, so that the bottom of the slot that the truss rod is sitting in is curved. And then the single action truss rod is forced into that curve when it's installed into the neck. So the truss rod itself is slightly bowed. And then when you adjust the nut and tighten it, you're forcing that rod to straighten out, and that forces the neck to straighten out. So that's how you control up bow with a single action truss rod. So if you're building a vintage style instrument and want to maintain that authenticity, you would probably want to use a single action truss rod. But if your main concern is versatility, then I would highly recommend that you use the double action truss rod. And that's all I use. This is a double action truss rod. Now, normally double action truss rods that you purchase today in the modern era have a shrink wrapped coating on it, like this blue coating that's applied over it. The purpose of that is to keep the truss rod from rattling when it's in the truss rod slot. It also helps to prevent glue from getting into the truss rod when you glue on the fretboard. In truth, though, I found that double action truss rods, even with the shrink wrap, will still rattle. If your truss rod rattles and it's a double action, you can just apply a little bit of tension to the truss rod to eliminate that rattle. But with a double action truss rod, you can adjust it to bow up or to bow down to control whatever is happening with your neck. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, I would encourage you to click the thumbs up button down below. Do it right now. It's a great way to show my channel support, and it doesn't cost you anything. But if you'd like to take your support to the next level, you can visit my eGuitar Plans web store or my Highland Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. And any purchase you make there is going to help support this channel so that I can keep making guitar building videos and sharing my knowledge and experience with you. You can also click the thanks button down below and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. But if you want to get the most out of my channel, I would encourage you to click the join button down below and consider becoming a member. As a member, you're going to have access to videos just like the one you're watching, but with a lot more information and detail, and best of all, no ads. Now let's get back to the video. So in terms of versatility, the double action truss rod is king. However, there are some disadvantages to the double action truss rod. One is the dimension of the rod in its height. It's taller than a single action truss rod. As a result, you have to route a deeper slot in the neck to accommodate the truss rod. And that means you have to have a neck that's thick enough to accommodate that slot. So if you go too thin, you run the risk of the truss rod breaking through the back of the neck because the wood there is too thin. Now you can purchase low profile double action truss rods. I know that StewMac sells one. And there may be others out there that are also low profile. But that's one consideration you have to consider when selecting a double action truss rod. That is a con. Another con is the weight. A double action truss rod weighs significantly more, almost double what a single action truss rod weighs. So it is going to add quite a bit of weight to your neck. So that may be something you want to consider. If that's, you want that versatility but want lightweight, you might want to consider a carbon fiber double action truss rod. Those are out there. However, they're not cheap and they aren't very common. So you'll have to do some searching to try to find one. And you may find once you've located someone who's selling them that they are probably out of your price range. But that is an option if you're so inclined. Now, when it comes to adjusting the truss rod, there are basically 4 different types of adjustment. There is adjustment with a hex wrench, which is what this truss rod uses. It simply fits in the end and you turn it either clockwise or counterclockwise to adjust the truss rod. There is also a nut which is slotted for a screwdriver, and that's really handy, especially if you're a touring musician and don't have a lot of hex wrenches, which if you're a touring musician you should have hex wrenches. But if you don't, you can just grab a screwdriver to adjust the truss rod. There's also the spoke wheel, and the spoke wheel is a handy it's a round wheel at the end that has holes drilled all the way around its edge, and you insert a tool into it and then turn that spoke wheel to adjust the truss rod. You can turn it in either direction. And then there's the adjustment nut, which is an actual nut that requires a special driver to adjust. Now typically those adjustment nuts are found mostly on your single action truss rods. So if you've ever adjusted a truss rod in a Gibson Les Paul, you know there's a big nut there that you have to insert a socket in order to adjust it. And typically that adjustment nut is located at the headstock for the single action truss rod. With a double action truss rod, it can be either at the headstock or at the heel. And in truth, that's really personal preference as to which one you want to do. I've had people ask me if there's an advantage to having it at the heel as opposed to the headstock. And I've done both many times, and I don't find really any advantage. The one difference that I have thought about, and I'm not sure if this is a big issue or not, but when you have the adjustment at the heel, there's a portion of the truss rod that's bending that's right over where the neck meets the body. So it's possible that force is being exerted in this area that might be, you might consider it to be excessive, and it might have an effect on the joint, whether it's a bolt-in or a set-in neck. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. It's just something that I've kind of thought about when I've built guitars using the heel adjustable truss rod. I prefer to have, in most of my guitars, the truss rod ends right where the heel meets the body. So whether that's an issue or not, like I said, that it may or may not be. Now, with the adjustment at the heel, you can use pretty much any kind of adjustment style nut, whether it's the hex or the screwdriver or the spoke. Any of those will work at the heel. However, at the headstock end, it either needs to be the one that's adjustable with the hex wrench or possibly the screwdriver, because the spoke wheel is too bulky to fit up here. There's no real place for it to be, and you'd have to route away so much material that it would weaken this area where the headstock meets the contour of the neck. So it really just is, it comes down to personal preference which one you want to do. They both require a little bit extra routing in order to provide access to the nut, but it doesn't really matter whether you're providing that access at the heel or at the headstock. And like in the case of a flat headstock on a Fender guitar, you have to drill a hole into that slot, which can be a little bit of a challenge for some folks. Although if you make a simple fixture, like a block of wood with a hole drilled through it that you can clamp to the headstock, you can guide your drill bit into that hole and drill a perfect hole that lines up with your truss rod. Now, when it comes to installing a truss rod, in my opinion, the double action truss rod is easier to install because you're simply routing a straight slot down the center of the neck. And you'll have to route a little bit extra where the adjustment nut is in order for it to fit properly. But it's much easier than a single action truss rod, because in a single action truss rod, that slot, the bottom of it has to be curved. And then when you install the truss rod, you have to install a strip of wood over the top to force it down into that curve. And that way, when you adjust the truss rod, you're putting tension on the truss rod, which forces it to straighten, and that straightens the neck. So it's a little bit more technical when it comes to routing that slot and then cutting the strip of wood that fills in. And in some cases, if you're doing the skunk stripe as a method of installing the truss rod, that in itself can be a bit of a challenge to get it to get everything routed properly and to fit tightly and to look professional. So I think that routing for the double action truss rod is much easier, so the installation is much easier. Now, I realize this is kind of a complicated subject, and I hope I've answered your questions in an adequate manner. And if not, please post questions or comments down in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to try to clarify. But it is kind of a confusing topic to discuss. And at any rate, if you've enjoyed the video and thought it was useful, please give it a thumbs up. Stop what you're doing. Click that little thumbs up icon down below. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really helps my channel. And you don't have to spend any money. And of course, if you want to take your support to the next level, you can do all the things I mentioned earlier in the video. And until the next episode, as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for more guitar building videos.